Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started today. This again. Okay. Thank you for being here today for the Illinois Soil Health Week presentation on the Quad Cities Climate Assessment Applications for Soil Health and Water Quality. My name is Nina Struss, and I wanted to just go over a few housekeeping items today before we get started. So today's presentation will be recorded. If you have questions as we go throughout the presentation today, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And as we get started, I'd love to know where you're from. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you would like to today, since I know this is a virtual event, so you could be tuning in from anywhere. So please feel free if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat. While I give a little introduction of myself, as I mentioned, my name is Nina Struss, and I am the River Health and Resiliency Organizer for Prairie Rivers Network based in the Quad Cities region. If you're not familiar with Prairie Rivers Network, we work to protect water, heal land, and inspire change throughout the state of Illinois. And as the River Health and Resiliency Organizer, I work to advance nature-based solutions specific to river health in the Quad Cities. Most specifically, I have been engaged in working on this climate and vulnerability assessment, which I will speak more about today. A little fun fact for you all, I'm actually very new to the environmental sector. I actually have been working for the past 12 years as a registered dietitian. So this is a little bit of a leap for me into a new area, a new career field, although I'm sure many of you understand the connection between food and our environment as well. And so I am just really excited to kind of go down this new path as well and talk to you all a little bit more today about the work we've been doing here in the Quad Cities. So in the summer of 2023, the National Wildlife Federation initiated a climate vulnerability assessment in the Quad Cities to serve as a resource and tool to advance future conversations around natural infrastructure and resilience. The purpose of this assessment is to equip local leaders, decision makers, and community members in the Quad Cities with relevant information about the impacts of climate change, empower community members to identify and pursue greater investments in the long-term resilience of the community, including through nature-based projects where appropriate, and serve as a foundation for stakeholders to make informed choices and leverage funding opportunities for present and future of the region. So this will result in a community-driven climate assessment for the Quad Cities region that involves input from relevant stakeholders and will be available by the end of this month of March 2024. This assessment is modeled after another assessment that was done by the National Wildlife Federation in the Texas Mid-Coast region. It's made possible through a multidisciplinary team. NWF brings decades of expertise working on conservation issues across the Mississippi River as well as in Illinois. Prairie Rivers Network is the affiliate, the state affiliate of NWF in Illinois, and are skilled in facilitation, coordination, and bringing together different stakeholders, and can support and advocate for solutions outside of the political landscape. And then University of Illinois Discovery Partners Institute brings the scientific knowledge and expertise of conducting climate assessments in other parts of Illinois. So you might be wondering why the Quad Cities, and if you're also not from the Quad Cities or familiar with them, we are actually comprised of 5 cities. Although if you ask, some of the locals here, we would probably say there's many, many more cities that encompass this whole area. But in particular, we look specifically at Bettendorf and Davenport on the Iowa side, and Rock Island and Moline, and East Moline on the Illinois side as comprising the Quad Cities. And we are situated along where the Mississippi River runs from east to west. Home to nearly 400,000 residents and numerous businesses within the cities, the Quad Cities relies on the Mississippi River as a vital resource for manufacturing, commerce, and transportation, while offering recreational and outdoor opportunities to residents. The Quad Cities are vulnerable to, Sorry about that. The Quad Cities are vulnerable to river flooding and extreme rainfall induced flash flooding due to its proximity to the Mississippi and Rock Rivers. Here you can see flooding that was from the 2019 flood here in the Quad Cities, where we had the levee break on the Iowa side. This flooding jeopardizes public safety and day-to-day operations, affecting city infrastructure, businesses, homes, and people. Natural infrastructure plays a pivotal role in addressing the Quad Cities' primary environmental and social challenges. As you can see, we're in the Quad Cities, we're pretty used to flooding, especially on the Iowa side, but that one was a pretty extensive a flooding event here. This figure showcases the broad land cover in the region, which includes a combination of croplands, grasslands, and forests, along with emergent wetlands surrounding the water bodies. These features provide protective services through slowing runoff, increasing floodplain water storage capacity, enhancing surface water infiltration to improve water quality, and reducing urban heat island effect, while also sequestering carbon dioxide. And in addition to their hazard risk reduction benefits, several studies have highlighted the importance of natural features in fostering a sense of community, improving overall quality of life and human health, which was also echoed very frequently in the stakeholder interviews that we did here in the community. And this figure also shows the broader landscape as it pertains to a watershed perspective. So in our conversations with local Quad City stakeholders, one conversation we had numerous times was the necessity of looking upstream in the watershed for potential projects focused on nature-based initiatives to not only improve climate risk in those specific locations, but to also improve the downstream risk to the Quad Cities. So just taking a little bit of a look at the state of the climate science, we know human activities, particularly greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion and deforestation, drive global climate change. Both Illinois and Iowa are already experiencing the effects of climate change, including more frequent heat waves, milder winters, and changing patterns of precipitation. As climate change progresses and global temperatures continue to rise, these impacts are expected to increase over time. Illinois has experienced an overall trend in warming over the past century, where average daily temperatures have risen by 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit across most areas of the state. Projections indicate that historical warming will persist into the middle and late 21st century. Climate change can result in altered precipitation patterns, potentially leading to more intense rainfall events, increased flood risk, and more extended dry periods. Illinois has experienced an overall increase in precipitation over the past century, with average annual precipitation rising by 10% to 20% in most areas. Total precipitation has increased across all seasons. Temperature and precipitation changes, coupled with an increase in the severity of extreme events, will cause compounding impacts on agriculture, water resources, and ecosystems, which we will touch on in a few slides. In order to better understand the local impacts in the Quad Cities, we were able to look at climate models to simulate and project future climate impacts based off of what Quad Cities stakeholders had indicated to be the most significant climate issues or risks. These involved having conversations through interviews with various organizations and experts, as well as providing opportunity for public input in a couple of different sessions. And this really offered the space to be able to have our community members provide their insight and feedback on whether or not this assessment and the findings were headed in the right direction, and if there were any sort of gaps or additional considerations we should be taking a look at as we developed this assessment. As was expected, one of the most significant risks identified by stakeholders was flooding, for both flash flooding and river flooding. And extreme weather, especially extreme heat, came in next. And also, too, just some of those extreme weather events, the drought, wildfire smoke, even the increase in tornadoes and extreme precipitation events did come up in conversations as concerns in the Quad Cities as well. Now, predicting future flooding in the Quad Cities involves a range of factors, including global climate change, local weather patterns, and precipitation changes and land use. Because the Quad Cities are situated along the Mississippi River, the region is susceptible to both river and flash flooding, and future risks will depend on several key elements. Climate change is a significant driver, potentially leading to increased rainfall intensity and more frequent extreme weather events that heightens flood risk. Local topography, existing flood control infrastructure, land use decisions, and urban development will also shape future flood hazards. Dynamic factors like topography, soil type, land use, and local water management system capacity should be considered in flood risk assessments. While rainfall is a common factor associated with flooding, it doesn't mean that flooding will occur everywhere it rains. Rainwater may run off and impact downstream areas, for example. The relationship between rainfall and flooding is influenced by a combination of natural and human-made factors. The next 3 slides I'm going to share with you are some of the modeling that we have done in this assessment that takes a look at the flood risk here in the Quad Cities. We have maps showing early century, mid-century, and end-of-century flood risks. And I will kind of toggle back and forth between a couple of them so you can see a little bit of the differences as it pertains on the slides. So you can see here flood model simulations here for early century, which is 2030 to 2050, will reveal that areas close to the Mississippi River are becoming more prone to river floods due to increased rainfall and higher stream flows, especially in downstream regions, especially here in the Quad Cities looking at Rock Island. When looking at these maps, it's important to look at the depth, which is available in the coloring. The little map description legend on the right hand gives you the depth there. So here in early century, you can really see just a lot of the yellows, so anywhere from 0 to 1 foot of flooding. But if you're not familiar with the Quad Cities, that may not seem like a lot depending on where you're at, but we're seeing a lot of that show up in some of our more developed towns where homes are even further inland that don't typically experience flooding currently, as well as causing some disruption in some of our bridges that you kind of see here as well. And here in the Quad Cities, we rely heavily on those bridges to go back and forth, whether people live on one side of the river, work on the other side of the river, or just even for recreational purposes too. Now I'll show you here mid-century is 2050 to 2080. And you'll see not only an increase in depth in area, so more of those blues, anywhere from 2 to 4 feet to even in some areas upwards of 8 feet, but also seeing an increase in flooding in areas that were not there prior. So you can kind of toggle back to early century here, and then again you can see here in mid-century, especially in areas that are over here on the right hand side, and more even areas that are kind of along the riverfront. And then finally, taking a look at the end of century projections from the years 2080 to 2100, again, a pretty decent increase in depth and extent of depth, depending on where you're at, as well as more infiltration flooding throughout the areas. So I'll kind of toggle back here. Again, early century, mid-century here, and end of century. And I want to add here, because even as I was doing some of these, the work with this in the presentation, these years seem very far off when we think about it in some cases. And I know for many of us, all of us maybe who are probably viewing today, we're probably not going to see the end of the century. But most of us have a kid or children of some sort in our lives, whether they are children that we teach or we go to church with, or they're our nieces or nephews or grandchildren or own children. And, they are going to see the end of the century. My son is 6 years old, and if he lives a healthy life by the year 2100, he will be 83 years old. And so these, taking a look here at, early to mid to end of century, these models could very much be what our children experience here through the end of the century. In addition to flooding, detailed explanations about the precipitation patterns and instances of extreme precipitation, which is considered surpassing the critical threshold of 3 inches per hour, are provided in the modeling of our climate assessment, and we have that per city as well. Here you can just see a generalized number of alarming flood events for each decade as it pertains to the cities. And for this map in particular, East Moline does include Moline as well. So the orange is both East Moline and Moline. And then both extreme heat and cold can negatively impact social and natural systems. Extremely hot days are the leading cause of weather-related fatalities in the United States and contribute to both poor public health and economic stress. As climate change continues, the Quad Cities are expected to see more hot days. So when that temperature increases above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and extremely hot days when the temperature increases above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The number of hot days will increase from 3 days at present to anywhere between 28 to 58 days based on the rate of global greenhouse gas emissions. So what does this mean? What are we looking at from a risk perspective? As the Quad Cities experience climate change, the region's key resources and assets are at risk. Ecosystems like our forests, wetlands, and rivers that provide temperature regulation, water storage, and drinking water benefits may be negatively impacted, and their ability to provide such vital services may be impaired. The intensity and frequency of flooding and drought are projected to increase. Floodwaters and increased precipitation can aid in the loss of soil and essential microorganisms from soil erosion. These microorganisms help to process and break down excess nutrients and pesticides, which in turn improves water quality. With increased flooding, there is risk for more pollutants across the landscape that ultimately degrade drinking water quality. For example, agricultural runoff containing sediment, excessive nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, pesticides and chemicals from agricultural and industrial sources already threaten river resources. Iowa and Illinois have the highest combined flooding and nitrate risks in the Mississippi River Basin. Exports of non-point source pollutants from cropland landscapes in these states have ranked highest among the basin in several studies. And high flows caused by localized extreme rainfall will continue to mobilize more nutrients. And in addition, not only to agricultural sources, but there are also urban sources that can increase. So things like lawn fertilizer, de-icing salt, and even pet waste can be common contributors as well to poor water quality. And especially when we look here in the Quad Cities, there is a lot of riverfront fishing that goes on, not only for just a good pastime, but a lot of our Quad Cities locals rely on that as a food source as well. And if we have poor water quality, that can also lead to unsafe fish consumption. When we look at, agricultural and soil health, the increased days of heat and water stress may reduce corn yields by mid-century, with declining soybean yields to follow. Warming temperatures will also shift where certain crops can grow in the region. Warmer temperatures and increased precipitation may lead to increased risk of drought and decreased soil moisture, impaired plant physiology, and a reduction in crop yield and/or crop loss. Increased flooding and precipitation may lead to prolonged field wetness. Wetter soils can lead to increased soil erosion and nutrient loss, and impaired root growth function or reduction in crop yield and/or crop loss. Overall, the potential higher production costs and lower yield for some crops may be seen looking at the increased heat and flooding and drought risks. It can also threaten the region's economic viability and public health. critical infrastructure that connects our region, like the I-74 bridge, may be more prone to flooding. And significant health risks like stroke and heat exhaustion are likely to increase with more days above 95 degrees, which could heavily impact those outdoor labor conditions for construction and agriculture as well. Now, not all communities will equally experience climate change impacts. Communities within the floodplain tend to be more susceptible to flood risk. Older adults, lower socioeconomic groups, people with disabilities, BIPOC communities, unhoused communities, immigrant and refugee populations, and renters are groups already facing higher risks here in the Quad Cities and will most likely be disproportionately affected as well. Now, we like to make sure that we say over and over that this assessment is not just a doom and gloom report. We really tend and hope to inspire community-wide support and understanding of nature-based solutions and resilience, and to really just make sure that we're not discouraging from the resilience planning. And it's also important to note that these findings are not static, and the climate risks are projected based on the path that we are on right now. But we have the power to change the trajectory by changing the way we develop in the future in a way that is in sync with our natural features and make investments to protect and strengthen these features. Climate change is also an interdisciplinary problem and requires interdisciplinary solutions. Resilience planning not only involves the urban landscape of the Quad Cities, but also looking outward in the watershed for projects to increase the resilience of the Quad Cities landscape and communities. So nature-based solutions are designed to conserve, restore ecosystems, or mimic natural systems, and are cost-effective solutions for mitigating natural hazards that provide social, economic, and environmental benefits. But implementation must consider scale, location, and community needs and desires. These solutions are often interchangeable with the words natural infrastructure or green infrastructure. And when we say nature-based solutions, we mean the actual conservation and restoration of natural features like wetlands, forests, floodplains, and stream banks. But the term also applies to the way that we develop that is complementary to nature. So, for instance, approaches like flood buyouts, where the goal is to move and relocate communities out of harm's way, and conservation easements, which limit development in flood-prone areas. Both of these are considered to be a nature-based solution because we now have land that can be used as a more natural space to help mitigate those climate risks. It's also important to consider equity. Previously I had mentioned making sure that we are developing in a way that is complementary to nature, but that we're also looking at the community needs and the desires. And historically, not all communities, especially those communities that are usually directly affected by these climate risks, have been included in the planning, design, and execution of projects. And if not implemented with careful community engagement, even nature-based projects, even though they're beneficial to the environment, can have unintended negative consequences like gentrification and displacement of those primarily socially vulnerable communities. So it's really important to have that increased participation of and partnership with local stakeholders as community experts at every stage of planning, project implementation and identification through stewardship to lead to more equitable outcomes that align with local preferences. A really great example of that here in the Quad Cities is the Mississippi River Equity Vision. It is a Quad Cities crafted document that really seeks to align stakeholders in the pursuit of a clean and sustainable Mississippi River. And it focuses on the lived experience of underrepresented and historically marginalized community members. Nature-based solutions are more dynamic and able to adapt and usually even grow stronger with time. Approaches to conservation in the way that we develop are also considered to be nature-based solutions. developing in a way that considers not only the central affected communities or areas, but also communities and areas upstream and downstream would be considered also a nature-based approach. This assessment is a tool to help empower communities to understand the climate risks and potential impacts that nature-based solutions can offer. Our assessment tried to provide recommendations and site-specific analysis to quantify nature-based solutions for the Quad Cities, but there are other large-scale practices that can have benefits for flood reductions and overall improvement to soil health, especially as it pertains from a broader watershed approach to climate risk reduction. Examples of nature-based solutions that could help maintain and repair soil health could include cover crops or reducing tillage to help increase that water holding capacity, filter strips or riparian buffers in flood-prone areas, selecting soil stabilizing crops, installing grassed waterways or prairie strips, and incorporating agroforestry practices to reduce the rate of soil erosion. In the next few slides, the next 3 slides, I'm going to show you what we took a look at from that climate modeling standpoint. So those 3 climate models that I showed you previously, the early, mid, and end of century, and how those can be potentially changed with the implementation of nature-based solutions. So this assessment analyzed the effectiveness of a few types of nature-based approaches by overlaying the flood risks with site-specific nature-based solutions, such as vegetative swales, permeable pavements, and green roofs. Across each of the Quad City communities, the performance of these nature-based solutions was evaluated based on the predicted reduction in peak runoff and improvement in the infiltration capacity as compared to the baseline absence of nature-based solutions. The top map there is the map that you've seen previously here with the early century of our flood risk here in the Quad Cities, and the bottom is the highlight of flood reduction benefits. So showing that reduction in peak flow discharge and an increase in infiltration where these solutions could be implemented. And again, it's important to note that while this climate modeling generally shows that even smaller site-specific nature-based solutions can significantly decrease flood risk by reducing runoff and increasing infiltration to the ground, it's really important to look at the future modeling too, to understand how well these specific nature-based solutions will work based on their location and the scale, and also how those solutions might impact those specific communities. And again, making sure that to note that we are looking at specific reductions or specific measures here in the Quad Cities, but also we are heavily influenced by upstream runoff. So larger interventions further upstream in the wider watershed, like wetlands, could offer watershed-wide flood mitigation benefits. Here, specifically in the Quad Cities, those green roofs and permeable pavements could offer site-specific solutions for that urban runoff and local flooding. And then here is the end of century results. So again, really taking a look at these maps and seeing not, a complete elimination of flood risk, but definitely a decrease in the extent and the depth with the before and afters of looking at that nature-based solution implementation. Here is another example of nature-based solutions impacting the effects of climate change. On the graph to the left, you can see the number of alarming events predicted for each decade through the century for the Quad Cities. Again, East Moline does include Moline here, so that orange does include 2 cities. On the graph on the right, you can see how implementation of nature-based solutions drastically impacts the number of alarming flood events for some of the Quad Cities. Throughout this climate assessment, Quad City stakeholders were engaged to initially understand regional needs and opportunities and then provide feedback on preliminary assessment findings. Education, research, and funding arose as top priorities for advancing regional resilience. Moving from that planning to the implementation phase was the most common gap identified by stakeholders. So this one thing that is really important to mention, I've kind of already mentioned it once, is that this assessment is not a prescriptive plan. It intends, so we don't, say city by city, this is what each city should do in terms of specific nature-based solutions in order to reduce those climate risks. Instead, it really is a tool to communicate and empower Quad City residents, businesses, leaders with a baseline level knowledge of climate change and its impacts on local systems. This involves educating about climate resilience planning, including nature-based solutions, the benefits and co-benefits, and eventually building and inspiring community-wide support for the recommendations emerging from this assessment. Key considerations for effective resilience planning can include things like recognizing natural systems as critical infrastructure, considering equity implications of nature-based solutions, or integrating nature-based solutions into existing planning processes. The National Wildlife Federation has developed these 7 key principles to consider for nature-based solution implementation at the local level. And these principles also, in fact, guide the overall work that we are leading in this space and how we approach nature-based conversations in the communities where we are working in. Now, as I mentioned, funding did come up as one of those tiers. And so the National Wildlife Federation has created an interactive database for communities interested in pursuing federal funding and or technical assistance for nature-based solutions. With the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, there was significant influx of federal funding for nature-based projects. The bill and the IRA both supplemented current programs and created new ones to address issues like climate change and environmental justice. The Funding Nature-Based Solution Database was designed to raise awareness of the number of federal programs funding natural solutions, including lesser-known programs. This is regularly updated to reflect the federal landscape, and the database also does feature different types of filters, so you could search things like cost share requirements, recipient eligibility, support type, etc., that helps users find programs that best meet their unique needs. And that is available here through this QR code to the right. The National Wildlife Federation's Conservation Champions program, formerly the Cover Crop Champions, offers grants up to $15,000 for farmers and outreach partners to learn and develop creative outreach strategies that target new farmer audiences and increase the rate of soil health practice adoption in the Midwest. And then finally, the Grow More training by the National Wildlife Federation's agricultural team has spent the last 9 years studying farmer decision-making and developed the Grow More training to help outreach professionals learn and implement outreach and messaging that more effectively engages the middle adopter farmer group. So next steps and future direction of the assessment here in the Quad Cities, and also as it pertains to our work through NWF and Prairie Rivers Network, we will be, it will include first and foremost the release and dissemination of the assessment here in March. And as I mentioned before, climate change requires all of us to work together creatively. Through the dissemination of this assessment, we hope to leverage our findings to advance climate resilience in the region through nature-based solutions and potential funding opportunities. And our work will contribute to an organized community to support the region's resilience and adaptation planning efforts. So not just looking at the urban expanse here in the Quad Cities, although it will be a primary project, but also looking further out into the watershed and into the rural expanse as well, as that was communicated to be a really important aspect of Quad City community resilience, specifically from the Quad City community stakeholders here through those interviews and public session input sessions that we had. And then finally, we will be, finding different opportunities to be able to share this assessment. So not only in public forums like this, through webinars and presentations, but also through work one-on-one with the community members that we've talked to, and really kind of getting into those communities and understanding where potential risks are coming from with the modeling that we are seeing, and identifying projects that are going to be beneficial, not only to those communities that are affected, but also beneficial from a nature scale as well, in reducing these climate risks. So that is all I have for you all today. These are going to be our top 3 lead individuals from each of the organizations that worked on this project. If you have any specific questions, these are our contact information here as well. And I can always hook you up with their information too if you have any specific questions, but did want to take the time today to answer any questions if there were any in the chat today as possible. I'm gonna say, if you wanted to unmute, feel free. You could also unmute and ask a question, or if there are any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll hold that space for some questions here for the next 5 to 10 minutes. If you're wanting to hop on to the next thing of your day too, you're more than welcome to do that as well. As I appreciate all of you hopping on today to hear a little bit more about this project and how we are looking not only at the Quad Cities, but in the wider watershed landscape as well, to help improve the resilience in our communities, as well as improve soil health and water quality. Great. Well, it looks like we have a quiet group and don't really have any questions. So I will thank you all again for hopping on today and joining me. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.